Marvel's Spider-Man movies are unique in that while Marvel plays a big role in the making of them, they are in fact Sony's movies. As has been widely published in the entertainment media, the Spider-Man rights sharing deal between Sony and Marvel was only for 5 MCU appearances, 3 guest appearances in Marvel movies, and 2 solo movies for Sony. Unless both parties bilaterally agree to extend it, the deal expires with the release of Spider-Man Far From Home, after which Spider-Man reverts to Sony, meaning he would be yanked out of the MCU. Presumably, he would then be put into Sony's cinematic Spider-Man spin-off universe, a cinematic universe which so far is only populated by Venom. So, for simplicity, let's call it the Venomverse. However, Spider-Man Far From Home ended in a way which suggests that Spider-Man will continue to be a part of the MCU. This leaves some open questions which we'll address in this video, such as whether or not the Spider-Man deal has been extended, what either outcome means for future appearances in the Venomverse, and finally, why characters like MJ, Ned Leeds, and Aunt May have been changed so drastically from their comic book counterparts. In this video, we will relay information we've received about the inner workings between Sony and Marvel. This information is consistent with certifiably authentic contracts and other legal documents, which we have access courtesy to the 2014 Sony hack. Since at this time it cannot be independently verified, we stress it should be considered as rumor pending a further official verification. That being said, let's move on to what we've heard. On July 9th, Richard Rushfield's entertainment industry newsletter, The Ankler, reported that the original Sony Marvel Spidey deal to co-produce these movies stipulated that if this incarnation of Spider-Man cleared $1 billion, Marvel would get to oversee production of a third movie. If it didn't, Spider-Man would revert to Sony. Spider-Man Homecoming fell $120 million short of $1 billion upon its release 2 years ago, but after 1 week in release, Far From Home has already crossed the $600 million mark worldwide. At this stage, it is well within the realm of possibility that Spider-Man Far From Home could cross that $1 billion mark, which, if the Ankler is correct, would enable Spider-Man to stay in the MCU for at least 1 more movie. There are, however, some partially conflicting reports on the matter. According to some rumors that have reached us, the deal has already been extended and for multiple appearances. However, this cannot be independently confirmed. In either event, it does indeed seem like a deal extension is in the cards. We do not know for how long this deal extension is valid, but the same basic rules as before would appear to apply. The extension is for a fixed number of appearances. Unless it is extended yet again before the new endpoint, the deal expires and Spider-Man will be yanked out of the MCU then, reverting back to Sony, provided that Sony continue to fulfill their contractual obligations required for them to retain the Spider-Man movie license. We will get back to what those contractual obligations are shortly. For the time being, it would appear that Spider-Man isn't going anywhere. However, that has some repercussions for the possibility of Spider-Man showing up in any future Venom movies. Sony have been ambiguous on whether or not Spider-Man will be appearing alongside Venom on screen since before Venom was released.
MCU as such, but can we see him?
Well, they are tangential because they take place in the world that this Spider-Man lives in. But as far as I'm concerned, I hope we keep making movies with Marvel and keeping Spider-Man where he belongs.
So might we see him in Venom and Silver and Black?
Don't know.
The more accurate answer would have been, not for as long as Spider-Man is in the MCU. However, that would have been outright admitting to the entertainment media that Spider-Man being in the MCU and Spider-Man being in the Venomverse are mutually exclusive positions, as the Venomverse is not part of the MCU, and Sony desperately wants casual moviegoers to believe it is.
Well, those movies will all take place in the world that we are now creating for Peter Parker. I mean, there'll be adjuncts to it. They may be different locations, but it will still all be in the same world, and they will be connected to each other as well.
So there is a chance that Tom Holland as Spider-Man will pop up somewhere over there? There's always a chance.
There's always a chance. I think one of the things that Kevin has done with Marvel that's was so brilliant, and is by bringing the fans along and making each movie seem like a chapter in a book that you have to read that chapter in order to go forward. And I think the investment that the fans get to feel in being part of a larger story and understanding what's happening, I think is something that I know Sony would want to emulate.
In the event that the Spider-Man deal with Marvel had been allowed to expire, Sony would of course have been free to put Tom Holland's Spider-Man into the Venomverse. However, since the deal with Marvel by all accounts has been extended, that option is now off the table. Tom Holland's Spider-Man cannot appear in Venom as long as he is in the MCU. However, if Sony really wants Spider-Man in Venom, any Spider-Man, there allegedly is a way that can happen. If Sony could convince Marvel to sign off on it, they could put another recast Spider-Man into their Venom-verse. Again, doing so would require Marvel to sign off on it, and it may not be in Marvel's best interests to have another live-action Spider-Man running around competing with Tom Holland. Additionally, from Sony's point of view, featuring another recast Spider-Man in Venom would once and for all shatter any illusion that Venom is part of the MCU, so it is more likely that Sony will continue to be vague about Spider-Man appearing rather than admitting that he probably won't. This of course leaves the question, why are Sony releasing these Venom-verse movies to begin with? Contrary to popular belief, there is a complex legal rationale behind it, and it all comes down to retaining the Spider-Man license. In 2011, several years before the ride-sharing deal which would see Spider-Man enter the MCU, Sony and Marvel amended the Spider-Man licensing deal they had at the time. Only a summary of it was made available to the public, but the full details were made accessible with the Sony hack. Marvel had bought out Sony's 25% stake in all Spider-Man merchandise for a one-time fee, plus a movie backend. They also gave up what little creative control they once had over future movies, as well as their 5% share of the revenue from Sony's future Spider-Man movies. In hindsight, this might look like a terrible deal for Sony, however they were quite happy with it at the time. It gave the company a much needed cash infusion, and it gave them effectively 100% creative control over the production of future Spider-Man movies, largely cutting Marvel out of the equation. As long as Sony didn't use any character they didn't have full rights to, and they released a new Spider-Man movie within a contractually specified time frame, the Spider-Man rights would be theirs in perpetuity. With the leaking of this deal, we learned what the time frame was. 3 years and 9 months post the preceding film's release to commence principal photography on the next movie, and 5 years and 9 months post the preceding film's release to release a new film. If even one of the two deadlines are missed, the Spider-Man rights are forfeit and will revert to Marvel. In the aftermath of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 underperforming, and worse yet, Andrew Garfield, by all accounts, being fired by none other than CEO of the entire Sony Corporation, Kaz Hirai himself, the movie division found itself with its back against the wall. No matter what they did, they would have to recast. When faced with the choice of continuing the story that started with Andrew Garfield or rebooting yet again, neither seemed like a viable option. With even Sony Corporate in Japan pressing for a deal with Marvel to happen, the movie division, Sony Pictures, had no choice but to submit. And so, it was that landmark agreement with Marvel, which would see Spider-Man appear in the MCU, that came to be. As this agreement was made after the Sony hacked, it was not leaked, and all we know of it are the summaries that Sony and Marvel have chosen to share with the public. But just like with the 2011 merchandising agreement, there are details in it that have not been disclosed. However, we have heard some rumors, if you will, about what some of those details may consist of. Even if Sony and Marvel are working together on the MCU Spider-Man, and their short-term goals are aligned, their respective long-term goals are not. Sony's long-term goal is to hold on to Spider-Man forever and milk the franchise for all it's worth. This was made clear during the negotiations for the 2011 merchandising amendment. Sony wanted the rights reversion's deadline to be extended to 7 years between movies and 10 years between trilogies. They also wanted Marvel to stop charging them the bothersome rights extension payments. Marvel naturally did not agree to that, as doing so would have been tantamount to giving Spider-Man away forever for free with no hope of ever getting him back. Marvel and Disney's ultimate long-term goal is to get the Spider-Man rights back wholesale. Their problem is that Sony's hold on the character is ironclad. Short of a corporate takeover, the only way Marvel are ever going to get Spider-Man back from Sony is if Sony slips up and fails to produce a movie within the specified time frame after the release of the preceding movie. As such, the stipulation that Sony must release a Spider-Man movie every few years lest they forfeit the rights is still in play. Marvel and Disney would have it no other way. This, however, is where things get complicated. Since Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home are co-produced by Marvel, they don't count towards extending the Spider-Man rights for Sony. Only Spider-Man movies made by Sony can do that. Currently, Sony can't use Spider-Man himself as he is locked up in the MCU, but any movies based on characters that fall under the Spider-Man license count as Spider-Man movies, and towards extending the Spider-Man movie rights for Sony. This is why Sony must make and release movies such as Venom, Morbius the Living Vampire, and anything else they have planned, and why they must do so without the participation of Marvel, and do so outside of the MCU. Doing so has the added bonus effect of establishing a Sony universe that Spider-Man can be put into if the deal with Marvel reaches its endpoint without any further renewals. However, Sony's primary reason for making these Spider-Man spin-off movies without Spider-Man is that they will permanently lose the Spider-Man movie rights if they don't, even while Marvel are making MCU Spider-Man movies for them. However, the MCU Spider-Man movies themselves are also impacted by the division between Sony and Marvel. Prior to the 2011 merchandise agreement, Disney and Sony's respective legal teams went through all the characters and discussed back and forth which characters belonged to Sony and were cleared for use, which belonged to either Fox or Marvel and were off limits to Sony, and which were disputed, meaning more than one party had a legitimate claim on the character. These disputed characters were for the most part frozen and made unavailable to anyone. From what we understand, a related discussion took place when the Spider-Man rights sharing deal was being hammered out. The native MCU characters were clear-cut. Since they originated in the fully Marvel-owned MCU movies, Sony would have no claim on them, even those that were licensed for appearing in the Sony co-produced MCU Spider-Man movies. All the characters that fell under the Spider-Man license, however, were a different matter. While Sony, for all intents and purposes, owned the Spider-Man movie rights and all the characters in the Spider-Man library, they are technically only a licensee, while Marvel is the ultimate owner, although Marvel has no power over them as long as Sony holds the license. The legal wrangling here is complex, but what it comes down to is that any character from the Spider-Man license that Sony puts into a Marvel co-produced Spider-Man movie, they give Marvel a stake in. That doesn't mean anything while the Spider-Man sharing deal is still active. If and when it expires, all Spider-Man related characters that were in those movies will be disputed and subsequently frozen. To put it in practical terms, this means that if Sony had put, for example, a comic book faithful Mary Jane Watson or Harry Osborn or even Venom into Spider-Man Homecoming, they would have given Marvel a stake in those characters' movie rights. If Sony, for whatever reason, didn't want the deal to end when it expired, but instead took the Spider-Man license back, they would have lost the right to use Mary Jane, Harry Osborn, and even Venom. By giving Marvel a stake in them, these characters would be disputed, and therefore frozen, unavailable to either Marvel or Disney. The way around that is by creating new characters with traits of the originals for use on film, something Sony are legally allowed to do. This is the reason why all the Spider-Man related characters originating in the Marvel and Sony co-produced Spider-Man movies differ so much from their original comic book counterparts. If the deal between Sony and Marvel expires, the MCU MJ will be frozen, off limits to both Marvel and Sony, but Sony will retain the rights to use Mary Jane Watson, the original redhead, in future movies. Likewise, if the deal expires, the MCU Ned Leeds will be frozen, but Sony will retain both Ned Leeds and Gonka Lee of the comics. If the deal expires, the younger, fitter, redesigned arms-dealing MCU Vulture will be frozen while Sony retains the original geriatric spandex-wearing Vulture. If the deal expires, the younger, sexier MCU MILF Aunt May will be frozen while Sony retains the senior citizen Aunt May. If the deal expires, the MCU Iron Man Jr. iteration of Spider-Man wearing nano armor will be frozen while Sony retains the homemade spandex down on his luck spider. This you can apply to every character under the Spider-Man license appearing in the MCU. One way or the other, their appearance or backstory has been altered enough that they are different characters. This allows Sony to keep using their original counterparts in any future Spider-Man movies made without Marvel's involvement. Does this surprise you, or do you think all the pieces of the puzzle now fall into place? Be sure to let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a comment, like it, and help share it. Or if you didn't, tell us why in the comments. If you did enjoy it, then feel free to subscribe, but remember to hit the bell icon to select that you want notifications all the time, otherwise YouTube might randomly unsubscribe you. Midnight's Edge is completely independent and devoted to bringing you the intelligent analysis of the inner workings of the film industry and genre media. If you like what we do, then we would be very grateful if you could help us keep the lights on by supporting us on Patreon or on Subscribestar. Our backers receive exclusive rewards and bonuses. Before you go, check out these other videos that may interest you, and our sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark for more live shows and more laid-back content.